Imagine yourself standing in the heart of Rome in the year 67 AD. Before you, the crowd murmurs with excitement, and in the distance, Emperor Nero, the most powerful man in the world at that time, walks slowly across the forum. He moves with familiar ease, wrapped in the confidence of someone no one dares to challenge. Yet what truly holds every gaze is the figure beside him, a young empress, delicate in appearance, draped in shimmering silk and jewels. Everything looks like a scene Rome knows well. Emperor and consort, power and luxury, order and majesty. And yet, if you knew the truth behind that image, you might feel a chill run down your spine. Because the woman whose hand Nero holds before the public was, in reality, once a boy. His name was Sporus. And the story of how Sporus became the empress of Rome is not a strange anecdote meant to amuse, but one of the most brutal examples of physical and psychological abuse ever recorded in history. This is not a story told for entertainment, nor merely another shocking detail in the long list of Roman excesses. What happened to Sporus reveals a very specific and dark side of absolute power. When one person controls everything, life and death, law and morality, even reality itself, the boundary between desire and action can vanish entirely. There is no one left to stop them, no one safe enough to say no, and nothing so unthinkable that it cannot be done. Here, the tragedy does not begin with physical violence, but with something far more subtle and dangerous: obsession. It is what happens when love is no longer a bond between two people, but becomes a need for total possession. When grief is not faced, but twisted into a desperate urge to recreate, control, and replace. And when another human being is no longer seen as a person with will and emotion, but as a tool to patch the wounds inside the mind of someone in power. This story, therefore, is not only about Nero, a ruler infamous for cruelty and eccentricity, nor is it merely about the moral decay of an empire that once dominated the ancient world. At its center stands Sporus, a very young, almost anonymous human being, swept into a storm of power and delusion, stripped of identity, body, and choice, simply to serve the sick fantasy of someone at the very top of society. When we look back at history, we are often drawn to great names, to victories and struggles for power. But sometimes it is the small, painful, and difficult stories like this one that reveal the true cost of unchecked authority. Power does not only destroy those who hold it, it crushes those beneath it, people who never get their names written in a history through triumph or glory, but exist only as victims of their age. The story of Nero and Sporus, from its very first moment, when the emperor leads his empress through the streets of Rome, forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What happens when there are no limits left on human desire? And what becomes of those who are turned into instruments to satisfy that desire? When Nero first ascended the throne, few could have imagined that this teenage ruler would one day become a symbol of madness and decay in Roman power. He became emperor at just 16 years old, an age at which many people are still struggling to understand themselves, let alone govern a vast empire of tens of millions. Yet the early years of Nero's reign inspired real hope. To many in Rome, he appeared young, approachable, and different from his distant, cold predecessors. Nero began his rule with policies that pleased the public. He eased the tax burden on the poor, spent generously on festivals and public performances, and did not hesitate to appear among the crowds as one of them. He openly loved the arts, music, poetry, theater. He did not see performing in public as beneath the dignity of an emperor. On the contrary, he viewed it as proof of an enlightened spirit, where even the ruler of the empire could pursue personal passion. In hindsight, many historians admit that Nero once had the chance to be a decent ruler. He was surrounded by experienced advisors. The state apparatus still functioned smoothly, and Rome seemed to be entering a period of calm after years of upheaval. But that very calm, combined with the near-absolute power Nero held, quietly planted the seeds of deep corruption. The problem was not that Nero loved art, but that no one dared to tell him when he had gone too far. The longer he sat on the throne, the more he lived in a closed world where every word passed through fear. Praise became exaggerated, while criticism disappeared entirely. No one dared oppose the emperor. No one was safe enough to question or advise him. And when a person is never challenged, it becomes dangerously easy for them to believe that every thought is correct, every desire justified. That isolation pulled Nero further and further away from reality. He began to believe that he was not merely an emperor, but a misunderstood genius. When audiences failed to applaud long enough after his performances, he saw it as an insult. When someone seemed indifferent to his artistic talent, he interpreted it as conspiracy or betrayal. Slowly, insecurity and hunger for validation turned into paranoia. Absolute power also distorted how Nero saw the people around him. He no longer viewed them as independent individuals, but as tools to reinforce his image and satisfy his ego. Affection, loyalty, even human life itself became conditional. Those who pleased him were rewarded lavishly. Those who displeased him, even with a glance or a careless word, could disappear without a trace. Signs of violence grew increasingly clear. Nero became quick-tempered, prone to rage, and less able to control his emotions. His anger was no longer occasional outbursts, but destructive forces often directed at those closest to him. In Nero's world, the people nearest to him were also the most vulnerable, trusted, yet exposed to the full weight of his inner turmoil. His sense of self-importance continued to swell. Nero no longer wanted to be merely admired. He wanted to be worshipped. Ordinary praise was no longer enough. He needed to feel unique, irreplaceable. And when reality failed to meet that need, Nero began to bend reality itself. The line between what was acceptable and what was unthinkable slowly disappeared. It was precisely within this context that Nero transformed from a young emperor once filled with promise into an increasingly unstable man, living in constant fear of betrayal, of being forgotten, of losing his place at the center of the world. Power, instead of granting him inner strength, magnified every flaw within his soul. And when those flaws were combined with absolute authority over life and death, tragedy ceased to be a possibility. It became only a matter of time. As Nero sank deeper into the fragile world of his own making, Poppaea Sabina emerged as a figure both dazzling and dangerous. She was not merely a beautiful woman passing briefly through the emperor's life, but the kind of presence that commanded attention from anyone who encountered her. Historical sources consistently describe Poppaea as exceptionally attractive, yet what truly set her apart was her intelligence and ambition. She understood her own value within a court where power and beauty were inseparable, and she knew exactly how to wield both. In contrast to Octavia, Nero's lawful wife at the time, Poppaea seemed almost her complete opposite. Octavia was quiet and reserved, living strictly within the role of a political symbol assigned to her by the state. Poppaea, by contrast, was vibrant and self-assured. She did not shy away from public attention and appeared constantly aware that she stood at the center of the imperial stage. There was something difficult to define about her allure, both soft and sharp, seductive yet calculating. It was precisely this combination that drew Nero in, pulling him quickly into a relationship that went far beyond ordinary desire. The relationship between Nero and Poppaea began as a fairly typical affair among Rome's elite, where moral boundaries were often treated lightly. But it did not remain that way for long. To Nero, Poppaea soon became more than a lover. She turned into the emotional core of his life, a source of encouragement, a mirror through which he affirmed his own worth, and gradually, something he could not bear to lose. Affection transformed into obsession, and obsession into possessiveness. Nero's jealousy grew extreme. He noticed every glance directed at Poppaea, every word spoken to her by other men at banquets and gatherings. His insecurity became so overwhelming that he placed guard around her almost constantly, under the guise of protection, but in reality to maintain control. Poppaea was no longer free to interact as she once had. All her relationships. At the same time, Nero showered her with luxury without restraint. Rare jewels, costly silks, exotic perfumes. The imperial treasury was drained in service of proving both his love and his ownership. Eventually, Nero made a decision that shocked the court. He divorced Octavia in order to marry Poppaea. This was not merely a change in his personal life, but a declaration of power, a signal that he was willing to shatter political conventions to pursue his own desires. The marriage to Poppaea was celebrated with great splendor, yet behind the brilliance lay a domestic life that grew increasingly suffocating. Nero began isolating Poppaea from the outside world. Her family and former friends were gradually pushed away, replaced by people loyal only to the emperor. Their shared spaces became saturated with Poppaea's image. Paintings, statues, reliefs installed everywhere, from public halls to the most private chambers. She was present in every corner, as if Nero needed constant visual reassurance to quiet his growing fear of loss. Yet Poppaea was not a woman inclined to submit quietly. Though fully aware of the danger inherent in her position, she retained a measure of independence. She dared to speak up when she disagreed with Nero, dared to criticize decisions she believed reckless or irresponsible. She did not hide her sarcasm when Nero became too absorbed in artistic pursuits and neglected the duties of an emperor. In a court where silence was the key to survival, such behavior was both rare and perilous. That quiet resistance only heightened the tension between them. To Nero, Poppaea was both the object of his love and a challenge to his absolute authority. To Poppaea, love had become inseparable from fear, ambition, and pride. She did not wish to be merely an ornament beside the throne, yet neither could she easily abandon the position she had worked so hard to attain. Within this struggle, the seeds of tragedy continued to grow, waiting patiently for the moment they would erupt. The smoldering tension in Nero and Poppaea's relationship eventually found an outlet, but it was a tragic one. In the year 65 AD, an argument broke out in the palace, one that may not have seemed much different from their previous disputes. Ancient historians offer varying explanations. Some claim Poppaea reproached Nero for devoting more time to racing and performing than to his family. Others suggest she criticized him for placing art and personal image above imperial responsibility. Whatever the initial cause, the argument carried the full weight of everything that had accumulated before: jealousy, exhaustion, disappointment, and a form of power left unchecked. What made the situation far more serious was the fact that Poppaea was pregnant. She was not only the emperor's wife, but carrying a child who could become his heir. In such circumstances, her reproaches may no longer have been tempered by caution. She had grown accustomed to Nero's outbursts and may have believed that, as before, he would limit himself to words. But this time, Nero did not stop. In a moment of uncontrolled rage, Nero struck the woman he claimed to love above all others. Historical accounts differ on the exact details, but they agree on the essential fact. Nero beat or kicked Poppaea with enough force to cause severe internal injuries. This was not an accidental misstep. It was an eruption of violence from a man long used to acting without restraint. That single blow ended everything. Poppaea was gravely injured, and in the hours that followed, her condition rapidly deteriorated. What came next unfolded beyond even Nero's ability to command or reverse. Poppaea died, and with her, the unborn child. Only when death became undeniable did Nero fully grasp what he had done. The man who had ordered the deaths of thousands had with his own hands killed the one person who made him feel less alone in the world. Nero's reaction afterward was not ordinary remorse, but a complete psychological collapse. He clutched Poppaea's lifeless body, begging her for forgiveness while at the same time commanding her to live, as if the will of an emperor could impose itself even upon death. Nero summoned the finest physicians in Rome, promising lavish rewards if they could save her and threatening horrific punishments if they failed. Yet the medicine of the age was powerless, and no order, no matter how absolute, could bring Poppaea back. When he could not restore Poppaea to life, Nero turned to another way of confronting loss: denial. He refused to have his wife's body cremated according to Roman custom, instead ordering it embalmed and placed in a mausoleum more extravagant than those of many emperors before him. Nero proclaimed Poppaea divine, establishing temples and rituals in her honor. To him, Poppaea had not died. She had merely passed into another state of existence, one in which he could still remain bound to her on his own terms. Within the palace, reality itself began to warp. Nero spoke to Poppaea's body as though she were still alive, still listening, still understanding him. He kept her seat empty, yet reserved at banquets, and demanded that courtiers refer to her in the present tense. Anyone who showed discomfort or suggested that the emperor should move on from his grief was swiftly removed, sometimes even punished. The entire court was forced to participate in a collective performance, a theater in which death was denied, an obsession carefully sustained day after day. It was during this period that the final boundary between reality and delusion in Nero's mind dissolved completely. Poppaea's death did not awaken him to his actions. Instead, it pushed him deeper into a world of his own creation, where love, guilt, and power fused into something dangerously unstable. Nero could not accept that Poppaea was gone forever, and that refusal itself opened the door to a new tragedy, one even more cruel and inhuman, about to unfold. After Poppaea's death, the Roman palace entered a strange and oppressive phase. The atmosphere of mourning had barely settled before it was overlaid by something harder to define: denial. Nero could not accept that the woman he obsessed over had vanished permanently, and in his distorted mental state, he began searching for signs that Poppaea was still somehow present. It was within this context that Sporus entered the story, almost by chance, yet carrying with him a fate from which there would be no escape. At the time, Sporus was only an adolescent, around 14 or 15 years old. He had been born a slave in the imperial household, later freed, and continued to serve within the palace. On paper, this was a relatively fortunate position compared to that of most slaves in the empire. Sporus received an education, was assigned light administrative duties, and lived in a secure and well-provided environment. But that protection came with an unavoidable condition. His entire life depended on the emperor's will. A word of praise could elevate him, and a single displeased glance could destroy everything. What made Sporus stand out, and what ultimately sealed his fate, was his appearance. Several ancient sources note that Sporus bore a striking resemblance to Poppaea, particularly in his eyes and facial features. Under ordinary circumstances, such a resemblance might have been nothing more than a passing observation. But in Nero's mind, already consumed by obsession and loss, it became something far more significant. When Nero looked at Sporus, he did not see merely a teenage boy. He saw the shadow of his dead wife. In a world where the line between reality and imagination had been erased, that resemblance took on the weight of destiny. Nero began to believe this was not coincidence, but Poppaea's return in another form. To him, it seemed like a final opportunity to correct his mistake, to reclaim what he had lost, to continue a story he refused to accept had ended. There was, of course, one undeniable reality. Sporus was male. But to Nero, this was not an obstacle. For a man accustomed to bending laws, morals, and even human lives to his will, gender was merely another detail to be resolved. In Nero's thinking, if reality did not conform to his desires, then reality itself had to be changed. The decision was made not with hesitation, but with chilling certainty. Nero did not merely want Sporus to play the role of Poppaea. He wanted to turn him into Poppaea in both appearance and function. This was not a temporary disguise, but a total and permanent transformation. From that moment on, Sporus ceased to be regarded as an independent human being and became instead a vessel for sustaining the emperor's illusion. What must be emphasized is that Sporus had no ability to resist. He was too young, too low in status, and too dependent to refuse. In Nero's palace, silence was not consent. It was a condition for survival. Sporus may not have fully understood what was about to happen to him, but he surely understood one thing. His fate was no longer his own. From the moment Nero made that decision, Sporus' tragedy officially began. He was not drawn into the vortex of power by ambition or personal choice, but by a fatal resemblance and the shattered mind of an emperor. Sporus became the repository for Nero's pain, guilt, and obsession, without any regard for the cost to the young person standing before him. And within the palace's heavy silence, a life was slowly reshaped according to another man's will, setting in motion a chain of suffering that no one, not even Sporus himself, could stop. Once Nero had decided that Sporus would serve as Poppaea's replacement, the last remaining limits of humanity were erased. This was no fleeting impulse or momentary lapse, but a deliberate, calculated, and merciless plan. Nero summoned the most skilled physicians in the empire, men trained to preserve life, and forced them to take part in an act that stood in direct opposition to their professional conscience. Under the emperor's command, medicine became a tool in service of obsession. The procedure was carried out not to heal, but to alter a healthy body into something that matched the ruler's fantasy. Sporus was forcibly castrated, a procedure already dangerous under the conditions of ancient medicine, where sterility was virtually unknown, anesthesia crude, and infection a constant threat. Pain was unavoidable. The risk of death was ever present. Yet Sporus' survival was no longer the primary concern. What mattered most to Nero was the final result. This was not merely a mutilation of the body. It was an act of total destruction, aimed directly at the core of a human being's identity. In Roman society, masculinity was inseparable from honor, status, and the promise of a future. To be castrated meant to be stripped of one's social role, cast outside every recognized framework of belonging. After that operation, even if Sporus survived, he could never return to being the person he once was. The door back to his past had been sealed shut. The consequences of this act were permanent. Sporus lost the ability to reproduce, lost any chance of building a family in any sense acknowledged by the society of his time. In Roman eyes, he became someone incomplete, no longer truly male, yet not genuinely female either. A suspended existence, cut off from all natural communities. Even if Nero were gone one day, the mark of that surgery would follow Sporus for the rest of his life, an inescapable reminder that his body had once been seized and altered against his will. More terrifying still was the silence that enveloped the entire process. Sporus had no voice, no right to object, no place to seek help. Within the palace, where Nero's authority was absolute, the suffering of a teenage boy carried no weight at all. Those who witnessed it, from physicians to servants, understood that their own survival depended on obedience. Cruelty, therefore, did not unfold in chaos, but in cold order legitimized by power. After the surgery, Sporus was not only changed biologically, he was also stripped of every possibility of choosing his own future. He was no longer permitted to imagine a different life, a different path. Everything ahead of him had already been decided by someone else. From that point on, Sporus was no longer regarded as an individual with his own fears and desires, but as an object being completed to fit the role Nero had imposed. In this tragedy, what chills the observer is not only the intensity of the physical pain, but the calmness of the one who inflicted it. Nero did not believe he was destroying a human being. He believed he was correcting a mistake, recreating what he had lost. That self-justification made his actions far more dangerous than any momentary outburst of violence. When cruelty is cloaked in a language of love and personal need, it can travel very far without encountering any moral barrier. From that moment on, Sporus entered a new phase of existence, one in which his body and his future no longer belonged to him. The operation did not merely take away his reproductive ability or a part of his body. It took away his right to be someone in the most fundamental sense. And once identity itself had been erased, all further suffering became only a matter of time. After the surgery, Sporus' tragedy did not end with the loss of his physical wholeness. That was only the beginning. What Nero truly wanted was to erase the boy Sporus entirely and replace him with a new image, one that perfectly matched his obsession. Sporus was no longer called by the name he had carried since childhood. Nero gave him a new name, Sabina, the same name as Poppaea, Sabina, as if renaming him could summon the dead back into existence. Along with the name came an entirely new identity. Sporus was dressed in garments that had once belonged to Poppaea. Her jewelry, necklaces, rings, hairpins, was taken from storage and placed upon him, not as keepsakes, but as props in a grotesque performance. Each object carried the memory of a woman who had died, and now they were used to force a teenager to continue a life that was never his own. The transformation did not stop at outward appearance. Sporus was subjected to a comprehensive, meticulous, and unforgiving regime of training. He was taught how to apply makeup so that his face would resemble Poppaea as closely as possible, how to style his hair, choose fragrances, and coordinate clothing. But the harshest demands lay not in the powder or the dresses, but in far smaller details. How to walk with softness, how to lower his head, how to sit, how to place his hands, how to look at others while speaking. Even his voice had to change. Sporus was forced to practice speaking more softly, at a higher pitch, more slowly. Every gesture, every natural reflex was scrutinized and corrected. A misplaced frown, a step taken too quickly, a subconscious habit left over from his former self could be counted as a mistake. And mistakes, in Nero's palace, were never trivial. The most painful part was not learning how to become someone else, but being compelled to forget who he truly was. Sporus was forbidden to mention his past, forbidden to remember his old name, forbidden to behave as the person he once had been. Each day, when he looked into the mirror, what stared back was no longer a familiar face, but a stranger shaped by another man's desire. An image carefully polished, yet completely hollow to him. This erasure of identity happened slowly but relentlessly. It required no whips or public torture. It only needed repetition, day after day, until the boundary between who I am and who I must be became blurred. In such circumstances, holding on to any fragment of the former self was not only difficult, but dangerous. For even the smallest sign of resistance could provoke Nero's wrath, and fear was always present. Sporus lived in a constant state of tension, never knowing how the emperor's mood might shift. Today he might be caressed and indulged. Tomorrow he could become the target of sudden, senseless anger. Nero's love did not offer safety. It was more like a gilded cage, beautiful, luxurious, and utterly without escape. In that world, Sporus was not seen as a human being learning how to live, but as an image that had to be maintained. He existed to fill the void in Nero's mind, to play the role of the dead wife, to soothe an obsession that would never fade. And with each passing day, the distance between the real Sporus and the Sabina Nero saw grew wider, until even Sporus himself could no longer be certain whether that former self still existed somewhere inside him. Everything reached its peak in the year 67 CE, when Nero decided to formalize his obsession through a ritual that all of Rome was forced to witness, an imperial wedding. Officially, it was a grand event of the empire, prepared with full ceremony, tradition, and the familiar extravagance of the Roman court. The palace was lavishly decorated, the rites conducted according to the proper forms reserved for an empress. Nothing was missing that might turn that day into a wedding in every outward sense of the word. The guests were summoned in full. Officials, nobles, and military commanders were all required to attend. They appeared in formal court attire, bearing gifts, and took their places according to arrangements made in advance. By torchlight and drifting incense, everything looked no different from the countless imperial weddings that had taken place before. There was only one thing no one dared to say aloud, yet everyone understood perfectly well. This was not a normal marriage. Standing beside Nero in the ceremony was Sabina, the new name given to Sporus. A teenager who had been forcibly subjected to surgery, stripped of his former identity, now cast in the role of empress before the entire court. Words of congratulations were spoken, but they rang hollow. No one believed in happiness. No one believed in the sanctity of the ritual. Everyone was simply playing a role they had no choice but to perform, because silence and obedience were the only means of survival under Nero's rule. From the outside, the wedding appeared to be a demonstration of the emperor's absolute power. Nero could command the entire court to accept what was wrong as right, to see tragedy as celebration, to call abuse love. No one dared object. No one dared leave. Everyone present understood that a single misplaced glance, a moment's hesitation, could make them the next target of his unpredictable rage. Yet looked at more closely, this wedding was not a triumph for Nero, but the clearest sign of his mental collapse. Instead of confronting loss and guilt, the emperor chose to construct a collective performance and force an entire society to participate in it. His madness no longer unfolded behind closed doors or in private outbursts. It was brought into the open, legalized through ceremony and protocol. For Sporus, that moment carried none of the meaning of marriage. It felt more like a sentence pronounced in public. Before hundreds of eyes, he was officially sealed into a role he had never chosen. There was no retreat, no possibility of fading into obscurity. From that point on, his existence was bound to the image of an empress created by Nero, an image the entire empire was compelled to acknowledge. For the Roman court, the wedding was a chilling reminder that all norms could be bent when power rested in the hands of someone without boundaries. No justification was needed. No disguise was required. All it took was an order, and an empire would rise to applaud something they knew, deep down, was wrong. In that solemn atmosphere, amid forced congratulations and averted gazes, the truth stood naked and undeniable. This was not a day of joy, but the moment when all of Rome witnessed a human being sacrificed to the obsession of the most powerful man alive. From then on, madness was no longer rumor or whispered gossip behind palace walls. It had become an official ritual of the empire. After the wedding, Sporus formally entered a life that, from the outside, could easily be mistaken for glory. He was granted a private palace, surrounded by attendants day and night, dressed in the most expensive garments, and given access to objects once reserved only for the empress. Wealth was assured, status unquestioned. To the public eye, Sabina lived in the height of luxury, occupying a position countless people could only dream of reaching. But it was all a facade. Beneath that splendor lay a mental hell with no end in sight. Every day of Sporus' life became a performance in which no mistake was allowed. He was not permitted to live as himself, but had to live as Poppaea, the dead woman, complete with memories, temperament, and image shaped entirely by Nero's imagination. Sporus had to remember stories he had never lived, respond appropriately to memories that were not his own, and display emotions tied to a past he had never experienced. The greatest pressure did not come from acting, but from the constant fear that even the smallest error could cost him his life. A gesture that did not resemble Poppaea closely enough, a glance out of rhythm, a brief lapse in remembering who he was supposed to be in Nero's eyes, any of these could strike at the emperor's unhealed psychological wound. And when Nero's anger flared, no one knew where the consequences would end. Sporus learned to control every detail. Every word was carefully weighed, every expression adjusted. He lived in a state of perpetual tension, like an actor never allowed to leave the stage. There was no rest, no safe backstage. Even when alone, he dared not relax, because fear had burrowed so deeply that it had become instinct. Gradually, that exhaustion eroded Sporus' mind. He grew quieter, spoke less, and his eyes often seemed drained of life. The servants around him could see that the empress was flawless in ritual, yet they also sensed an unnameable gloom. Sporus no longer resisted, no longer expressed clear emotion. He existed like a carefully polished shadow, fulfilling his role with unsettling precision. The bitter truth was that even in his collapse, Sporus performed exceptionally well. perhaps because he understood that perfection was the only way to survive. Every smile, every gentle gesture became a layer of armor. Each day that Nero remained satisfied was a day Sporus was allowed to keep breathing. And so, amid outward luxury, he learned to accept a brutal reality. His safety depended entirely on continuing to please another man's obsession. That life offered no future to hope for, only a present that had to be endured one day at a time. Sporus no longer dreamed, no longer thought far ahead, and had no idea what would become of him if one day Nero no longer wished to see Poppaea's image. Until then, he remained there, in the role of Rome's perfect empress, concealing the collapse within behind an exterior no one was allowed to question. Sporus's fragile existence was bound to a single man, Nero, and when Nero's power began to waver, the entire world Sporus clung to trembled with it. The Roman Empire entered a period of instability. Revolts broke out in multiple regions. Loyalties once secured through fear began to crumble. The Praetorian Guard, the force that had been the emperor's final shield, turned away. The Senate, too, no longer wished to protect a ruler they now regarded as a threat to Rome's very survival. Nero, once standing at the absolute pinnacle of power, was now completely isolated. Those who had once bowed before him either fell silent or disappeared. The vast palace became terrifyingly empty. In those final days, Sporus remained by Nero's side, not necessarily out of loyalty, but perhaps because he no longer knew where to go, no longer knew who he was without the man who had determined every aspect of his life. That relationship, distorted and violent as it was, had become the only thread anchoring Sporus to reality. In 68 CE, when every path had been cut off, Nero chose to end his own life. His death closed a reign marked by violence and delusion, but it did not close the tragedy of those swept up in it. For Sporus, Nero's departure did not mean liberation. It merely opened a new chapter, just as cold and no less cruel. Without Nero, Sporus did not return to life as a free individual. He was not seen as a victim in need of protection, but as a grotesque relic of the fallen regime. Successive emperors quickly took possession of him, treating him as transferable property. The identity of empress that had once been constructed could no longer be shed. Sporus continued to be used, displayed, and violated, not out of love or obsession this time, but out of power and the morbid curiosity of those who inherited authority. What was most painful was that even as circumstances changed, the way people saw Sporus did not. He was not regarded as an individual with his own pain and memories, but as an object with symbolic value, something that could demonstrate dominance, authority, or simply the continuation of a brutal tradition. No one asked what Sporus wanted. No one offered him the chance to begin again. His tragedy therefore dragged on, long after the death of the man who had destroyed him. Nero lost power, lost his life, but what he had done continued to live on in another person's body and fate. Sporus became a living testament to a brutal truth. When someone is treated like an object for long enough, the world grows accustomed to seeing them that way, even after the one who first reduced them to an object is gone. Caught in the constant shifting of power, Sporus drifted from one owner to another, without choice and without refuge. Nero's fall did not end the chain of abuse. It merely changed who held the reins. And Sporus, from beginning to end, remained the one force to bear the consequences of a system in which power was always valued above humanity. Being passed endlessly from hand to hand eventually dragged Sporus to the deepest point of humiliation. Under the new regime, he was no longer merely a remnant of Nero, but became entertainment in the most literal sense. Those now in power made no effort to preserve the illusion that Sporus was an empress or a symbol of deranged love. To them, he was simply a body that had already been reshaped, a strange creature to be displayed for the amusement of the masses. What was ultimately planned for Sporus was so cruel that even what he had previously endured seemed almost mild by comparison. He was forced to take part in public performances designed to humiliate, reenacting mythological scenes twisted to satisfy the crowd's curiosity and desire. No longer confined to private banquets or the gaze of a mad emperor. This time there were thousands of eyes, laughter, cheers, and the collective delight of spectators watching how far a human being could be reduced. For Sporus, this was the final boundary. For years, he had been stripped of choice, forced to alter his body, compelled to live under another person's name, required to remember memories that had never been his. He had learned silence, endurance, and flawless performance as a means of survival. But being exposed before the public, turned into pure spectacle, was the total annihilation of the last shred of dignity he still carried within himself. No one knows exactly what Sporus thought during those final days, but it is reasonable to believe it was not an impulsive decision. It was the result of a long process of being cornered, when every possible escape had been sealed off. In a world where all choices were made by others, death suddenly became the only choice still within his control. In 69 CE, not yet 20 years old, Sporus took his own life, most likely by poison. There was no grand ritual, no official mourning, no one to tell his story with compassion. Yet that act carried more meaning than all the titles that had ever been imposed upon him. Sporus's death was not an escape born of weakness. It was a final refusal. A refusal to continue being dragged along as an object. A refusal to let his body and identity remain a stage for the cruelty of others. In that moment, Sporus reclaimed what had been taken from him since he was a teenager, the right to decide his own fate. There's a painful paradox here. Sporus was truly free only at the moment he ceased to live. But that freedom, brief and bitter as it was, still carried the weight of resistance. It showed that no matter how bent or distorted he had been, there remained within him a part that had never completely disappeared. In Roman history, Sporus's death is often mentioned only as a footnote, a sad detail among the many oddities of Nero's reign and the chaos that followed. But looked at more closely, it is the story of an individual crushed by power, who ultimately chose not to let that power decide everything any longer. Sporus left no legacy, had no voice in the historical record, and no chance to tell his own story. The only thing he left behind was a silent yet decisive act, one that reminds us that even in the most brutal circumstances, a human being can still find a way to assert their dignity, even if the price is life itself. Looking back on the entire story, Sporus is often remembered as a symbol of the decadence and madness of Nero's reign. But stopping there means repeating the very way the ancients treated him, turning him into an image, an example, a shocking detail, rather than recognizing him as a flesh and blood human being. In truth, Sporus was not a symbol of depravity. He was its clearest and most painful victim. The tragedy of Sporus did not lie merely in being dragged into grotesque rituals or forced to wear the false title of empress. The greatest tragedy was the complete erasure of his identity. From a teenager with a name, a face, and a future, however fragile, he was transformed into a replica of a dead woman. His name was replaced. His body was altered. His voice, gestures, manner of walking, even his memories were forced to be borrowed from another life. To the point that, in hindsight, history itself can barely tell who Sporus truly was. We do not know what he liked, what he feared, or what he once dreamed of before being pulled into Nero's obsession. There are no accounts of his childhood, no personal thoughts recorded, no opportunity for him to speak in his own voice. Sporus exists in history largely through the gaze of those in power, those who used his life as evidence of an emperor's eccentricity, rather than as the record of a life destroyed. That is precisely what gives this story its profound human value. It reminds us that absolute power does not only deform those who wield it, it crushes those closest to it. When there are no limits, no resistance, no one who dares to say no, power easily crosses every moral boundary. In such a world, human beings can be treated as objects, shaped, used, and discarded, solely to serve the desires and illusions of those at the top. History is often told through the names of emperors and generals, those who shaped the fate of empires. But beneath those celebrated names lie countless nameless individuals who never had the power to record their own stories. Sporus was one of them. His story reminds us that history is not only about victories or the fall of dynasties, but also about the accumulation of silent suffering inflicted by power. In that context, Sporus' death carries a particular significance. It does not erase what he endured, nor can it compensate for his stolen youth. But it marks a rare moment in which Sporus was no longer a tool in someone else's hands. By choosing to end his life, he rejected the final role power sought to impose upon him. It was a small act in political terms, but immense in human terms. Sporus died as a free human being, if only in his final moment. Free not because freedom was granted, but because he seized it himself at the highest possible cost. And perhaps that is why his story remains memorable not only for its cruelty, but for its quiet, persistent reminder. Behind every great power lie human beings who are sacrificed, and remembering them, seeing them as human, is one of the few ways history can become more humane.